Okay. So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is the session on ethical and legal issues around agricultural data. This is part of the series of meetings, of sessions of the Improving Global Agricultural Data Community of Practice in the RDA community. The session today will last more or less 1.5 hours. I'm Valeria Pesce. I'm from the Global Forum on Agricultural Research and Innovation. I will explain in a few minutes why we are organizing this session, why we chose this topic. In the meantime, perhaps we can go through some very quick slides on housekeeping hints. Let's say these are not rules. It's a very, informal meeting, but we recommend that everybody stays on mute while the speakers speak, even perhaps disabling the video just for bandwidth's sake. Also, if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand and then speak, no problem, or you can just use the chat. There's the chat button, and you can. And when you ask a question, it would be nice just if you put your name and your affiliation, so that we know who you are and you ask your question. Very simple rules. These are our speakers today. So why did we choose this topic, legal and ethical issues around agricultural data? We at the Global Forum are conducting a global collective action, we call it, because it involves different stakeholders, on inclusive digital transformation of agriculture. So since we're working on inclusive digital solutions and the way of involving and giving voice to farmers, especially smallholder farmers, for us, the issue of data, since these are data-driven solutions, is key, and data governance is really an important topic in this area. So this is why we organized this session, and we have these experts in this session. We have Foteini Zampati, Caroline Wangiro Muciri, Lian Weisman, Ivo Hostens, and Mark Ryan. I will just give the floor to them. We can start with Foteini. I will just stop sharing my screen, and Foteini, while you share your screen, I will just say who you are. I will not, you can start sharing your screen, Foteini, whenever you like. We will not read aloud the bios of the speakers. You have the bios in the program, and Chelsea will kindly also paste the bios of the speakers as they speak in the chat. So here is Foteini Zampati. She's going to talk about ethical and legal considerations in digital agriculture, especially the concerns of farmers. Thank you, Foteini. Over to you.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you all for the invitation for today's event, which is very, very important. Just a clarification about my affiliation. It is in Germany, not in Greece, but it's okay just to mention that. So without any delay, I will talk what are the farmers' ethical and legal considerations in digital agriculture. What is this session about anyway, in a broader sense and in a general sense. So digital farming, we all know that has a lot of potential for advancing agriculture and giving farmers tools to be more productive and profitable. And although the benefits from digitalization are multiple, farmers feel that they are not the ones that they are benefiting from the value of data collected on their farms. Ensuring that farmers understand their rights to data and have access to relevant data is essential to harness the benefits for a better farm decision management. So I think that whoever is in the agricultural sector has been facing these ethical and legal questions about smart farming. So some of the most basic and important questions I would say is, what ethical principles need to be in place for the handling of data? Who owns data? Who has really actually control of the use of data? Who is entitled to the value of data? Agribusinesses, farmers, researchers, who? What is responsible data? Are farmers reluctant to share their data? And if so, why is the reason of doing that? How do we make information accessible to all actors involved in agriculture? And what about data protection? What do we mean by the farmers' rights to data? What is the state of recognition of farmers' rights on national and international level? These are the most, I would say, basic and important questions. We could also discuss them afterwards. And of course, farmers' concerns around data sharing is one of the most basic one is around data ownership. Who has control of access and use of their data? Issues around privacy, about their personal data. Within farm data, there is the difficulty also of defining what farm data is considered personal and not non-personal and non-personal data. For example, a name, an address, an ID is personal data, but soil data, weather data is not considered personal data, but what happens when we have location data and a farm can be identified and can be linked with the farmer, then there is an issue. Also, there are concerns about security. There is lack of transparency and trust. There is inequality of bargaining power within the contracts. We all know that the majority of the contracts are complex, even for the lawyers. There are unfair terms and conditions. In many cases, farmers are not really aware of their rights, their right to information, to access to their data, the right to data portability, the right to opt in and opt out. There is lack of awareness and informed consent from the data generator and primarily the farmer. There is lack of benefit sharing between farmers and agribusinesses. And as mentioned, in many cases, farmers are unaware of the value when they're sharing their data. This leads, of course, to the well-known data asymmetries, monopolies, power and knowledge imbalances between the stakeholders, because in many cases, for example, farmers don't really have access to the services, to the digital technologies. That leads to the digital divide, the well-known digital divide. There is also a risk of data misuse. There is issues around data literacy. So how should farmers' rights be implemented and protected? These are the basic questions. We definitely need a cultural shift. We definitely need to have farmers at the center of the discussions to, if we want to discuss more about an equitable and more inclusive data sharing. It is good that we are discussing about digital agriculture, but for me, it is essential to include farmers into the discussion. Start with them because everything is around them. Also, we need to have policy changes on a national, regional, international level to support farmers' rights to data information knowledge. We need to increase awareness of smallholder farmers of their position in the agri-food networks, educate and empower farmers via trainings, workshops, webinars, farm hubs. One good example with farm hubs is in Kenya. We need to include farmers' representatives, farmers' associations. They are in a better position to negotiate with various stakeholders, develop farm data standards. And we also need to develop ethical frameworks such as codes of conduct. So codes of conduct in agriculture are a good paradigm of a fairer data governance framework because they enhance trust, because they can really breach the legislative void, and they can set common standards for farm data sharing contracts. They can simplify the assessment of behaviors. They can raise awareness because they can change the way agribusiness think. And also an important element is that there is inclusiveness and participation, because within the code of conduct, there is a negotiation and could be a negotiation between agribusinesses or farmers or farmers organizations. So there is an open dialogue to negotiate the terms and conditions, which is very, very important for having fairer data sharing in the agricultural sector. And already you might be aware of it. I think the majority is aware of the existing agricultural codes of conduct worldwide. There is the EU Code of Conduct on Agricultural Data Sharing by Contractual Agreement. There is the American Farm Bureau Federation's Privacy and Security Principles for Farm Data Sharing, the New Zealand Code of Practice, the Australian one, the French Charter on the Use of Agricultural Data. Their aim is exactly the same, to provide some definitions, terms, issues around ownership, about consent. So within these codes of conduct, in many cases, we have the certification and compliance tools with the American Farm Bureau Federation Privacy and Security Principles. There is the IGAD Data Transparent Evaluator, where the technology companies need to submit their policies to an independent authority to review them and see whether they are compliant with the principles. And the law firm of Johnson Ag is responsible for evaluating these policies. And if these agribusinesses find that they are compliant, they get the Ag Transparent seal. They only need to reply to 11 updated questions. And same is a little bit with New Zealand Farm Data Code of Practice. Again, there is a self-audit statutory declaration and review panel assessment by Farm Data Accreditation Limited. And if companies, again, seem to be compliant, they get the annual license and certificate and as well a trademark. With the EU Code of Conduct, there is no certification, only a checklist with 10 questions. Certification schemes, nevertheless, are very, very important because they can develop transparency and trust around data uses. They can enhance trust because producers can really be certain that exactly an independent authority has evaluated the provider's practices and they have been found worthy of certification. And one good example and one practical example, I would say, is the Gordon CTA GFAR toolkit on codes of conduct that was produced after reviewed the existing one. So we developed at Gordon and CTA and GFAR this toolkit where it features 17 clauses which are not exhaustive, but the purpose of this toolkit is exactly, here are the clauses. The tool has the purpose to create a more customizable code of conduct to the needs exactly of every stakeholder, whether it is a researcher, whether it is an agribusiness, a farm association. They can create their own code of conduct based on their needs, on their interests. And this one specifically was created based on farmers' needs with, I would say, their hierarchy of their concerns. It was created, this one. So as mentioned, for me, it's a very good example for having a fair data governance framework. We can include farmers and farmers associations into the discussions. And by saying that, this is the last slide of my presentation, but nevertheless, I would say, as mentioned, that a lot has been done since the beginning of the discussion of ethical and legal considerations. And I'm very happy to continue these discussions specifically today with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Forini. Thanks also for mentioning the toolkit and everything that was done in the past, because of course this is an ongoing discussion among experts and practitioners on all the legal and ethical issues on agricultural data. Now we have Caroline Angelo Muciri. Caroline, you can share your screen whenever you like. Caroline is an intellectual property expert. I think Chelsea will paste her bio now in the chat. And her presentation is on nuanced approach to data governance in agriculture. What must be on the agenda?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to have this conversation. I am happy to participate in this conversation mainly because of the value of data and I would honestly say my passion for small-scale farmers. And today I want to probably open the conversation again, following the conversation by Fontini on what legal and ethical issues we should be considering. So my presentation is covering, is going to be discussing on specific aspects that we need to have in mind because legal and ethical frameworks are always informed by the context of the people who are seeking to be governed. And to that extent, there are several questions that we need to consider when we are structuring data governance and the legal framework that surround data and data governance, especially in agriculture and in small-scale farmers. From my end, I am proceeding on the premise that one, the most important thing is that data is a resource for production. It is a necessary resource to production, and in agriculture, it is necessary because without it, then again, people are making decisions based on maybe assumptions that would not be productive at the end of the day. And when you look at data as a resource of production, there are several issues surrounding it. These are some of the things that I picked up. And there's a question of the role of the structural systems in place. These are this would be the structures, the institutions that we have set up as a society or as any country would have set up. And then there's a question of equitable access. And equitable access, again, it enables everyone who is able to access the data, who requires the data as a resource for production, to be able to access it freely or either at a cost that is, again, able to accessible and affordable to the people accessing the data. And also there are legal frameworks that would be in place. And I think this is what Fontini has covered, so I will not focus on that. And also there are limiting factors to access and production of the resources. So the question is, when we are talking about data governance, agricultural data governance, then what would be the limiting factors to access, and how can we go around those factors or those issues so that we can actually factor them in as we are structuring the governance system. Again, in the context of data in agriculture takes several forms. I categorize the data from agricultural data into three, and the first one is the farm data, really. And this is the farm where physically the land or the soil, if you may, is located, and that has data because, again, there's a question of environment that is surrounding the area that would be required for people in that area or in other areas, for instance, policymakers to make decisions based on the data that is available. And then there is also the farmer-related data, and this is the personal and non-personal data, the name of the farmer, what they do, and all that would be covered under the farmer-related data. And then there's which is for me the most important data actually, is the farming-related data. And these are the farming practices that are engaged or that the farmers engage with for them to be able to produce whatever it is that they're producing. And if you look at data in the context of farming related data, again, it is quite important because, for instance, it would be guiding the farmers as to at what point do you plant, at what point do you irrigate, do you apply chemicals and etc. So again, the question of access of such data is important and relevant to the whole conversation. There are other issues that surround data in agriculture, and again, again, data creation is dependent on these factors, and one of them is the size. And large-scale farming, there's medium-scale farming, and then there's small-scale farming. All of these people would be ideally generating data that is relevant to their form of agriculture and the size of the engagement that they have. Again, we also have the purpose of or the level of farming that is going on, and in this case, we are talking about subsistence farming, home farming, organic farming, and commercial farming. Again, the data that someone who is in commercial farming is producing may not be relevant to the person who is doing home farming or subsistence farming. So the question is, how do we again govern or manage the data that is coming and ensuring again that is accessible to everyone who is involved in the value in the process? And then there's the execution. How is the agricultural done? Fortini has talked about digitized agriculture, and in this case, we also have mechanized agriculture, and there are people who are actually, especially from a global south country, which is Kenya, we have people who are farmers who are actually still manually tilling land, and all the data that they are processing, I mean, they would be able to tell you that on some areas it is not possible to conduct farming because either the soil is rocky, the soil is soft, etc. All this is data, and the question is, again, how do we come back and set up a legal framework or an ethical framework that covers all those or makes specific consideration to these issues? Again, there are other people involved in the value addition process, agri-processors, etc. For those, I am not going to handle them for today because I believe they are at the second or the third stage of the value addition process. When you look at the term of the issue about data governance, ideally, we are looking at governance of data as a resource, as a production resource. So with that in mind, we look at data governance as a scheme that is set in place to identify the parties who are involved in the whole process, production, creation, management, etc. It also sets the rights and responsibilities for the parties or the stakeholders or anyone who is accessing or requires the data in this case. It also sets the structures and the processes required to manage the data, the management, protection of data, and the data assets that come from that process. And when supported, ideally, it should be supported by clear infrastructure. This is institutional setup by any country. These are data protection offices, data managers, and the legal and the technical, social, etc. All these institutions, infrastructural institutions, they should be able to govern, rather to manage or support the data governance process to make sure that, again, all stakeholders are catered for. Now, when we get to the context of the stakeholder, and this is where I think the crux of my presentation is at. I want to focus on the gender of the farmer and the historical background of the farming practices and the farmers as well, and also the environmental and social context for the farmers. Again, this is important because they inform how the data governance structure should ideally look like. Again, when we are providing or when we are making policies or context or contracts, we have to cater or we have to actually think about the gender of the farmer and how that impacts as to how they access, produce, or create data. Again, their historical background is important because, again, that informs how their environment or how they have grown to where they are, they would look like. An ideal, I would say, an ideal data governance structure would look like what is in front of you right now. And the institution, the legal systems, and the infrastructure, they have to consider, or they have to have the consideration of gender. And this is where I'm adding the historical background and the context of the people so that it can become a good governance structure. Again, this is sourced from Open Data, Data Watch in a presentation they made sometimes last year in New York. Now, so when we are talking about the focal points in terms of agricultural data, we are looking at data creation. And data creation, we have several parties. There are the farmers, and then there's the gender of the farmer. In most cases, at least from our country, global South countries, in most cases, the farmers are women. So the thing is, we have to be cognizant, take cognizance of their gender, because it again impacts how they access the resources. Because historically, the women have been excluded from very accessing resources, especially when it comes to the physical resource that is called the land. Again, the process of data creation it should be flexible. Ideally, it is flexible, and it should be also be adaptable in such a way that it is allowing or creating room to be adjusted as and when, and also to support any party who joins at any one stage. For instance, if you're talking about farmers at the stage of, planting stage, again, there would be a party who would be probably involved in the stage of crop management after the crop has germinated. If the process or if the governance system remains static, then that means we are not going to lock out any other party that would ideally be joining the process at a later date. Again, in agriculture, the process, agricultural process is a very, very long process. I mean, you plant today and then you have to wait for a period of probably 3 months, 4 months, 1 year perhaps. And within all this time, data is being created. It's a continuous process. So as we speak right now, there's data being created in anywhere where you are at. In terms of agricultural data. And then there's a categorization that I mentioned that is important, because again, it gives or it provides a leeway to manage different data using different mechanisms, so that we are not treating all data as equal across the board again, and also the purpose of the data again. Why is the data being collected? In agricultural data, there's a question of ownership and access to data. Again, the question of ownership has not been quite answered, but I think we all agree that access to data is important to agricultural production. And then the question then comes in, then how do we ensure that the farmers and the farmers who are women are able to access the data for them to be able to improve or make production-related decisions. Again, the governance structure should be able to guide and say that we recognize, the system recognizes that there are instances where women have been excluded, and for us not to continue excluding them, we need to put in these mechanisms to ensure that there is inclusivity at all stages. Again, there's a question of historical context. In this case, I am actually looking at one big context, which is colonialism, especially for countries that were colonized. And the thing is, after the colonialism process ended, again, the countries inherited institutions that were borrowed from their colonizers. And in most cases, there's always a conflict, because the colonizers' institutions do not respond to the societal or the environment of the colonized countries. Now, these conflicts have existed, and we can actually see them when we talk about other resources other than data. But now that we are having a conversation about data, now that data is the new resource that we are managing, how do we consider those historical contexts and how they have influenced societies and countries, again, in how they create data? For instance, I would give you an example from Kenya that data on women entrepreneurs, for instance, farmers, was not being collected because they did not own land. And yet they were the people who are actually on the land and doing and creating and making the production processes in agricultural processes. So that exclusion on its own is something that we have actually carried on. And it's only as recent as 1980s that we actually have started collecting data on women entrepreneurs. So you can imagine the gap that exists in terms of policies that have resulted out of the exclusivity that has happened. Yet these are institutions, rather, this is something that as a country we inherited and we continued implementing until the point where we actually recognize that it is not moving us forward. And also, again, there are existing institutions, and these are the institutions that we have either inherited or that we have created, not taking being specific or actually acknowledging that we have there's an interruption in the progression, in the development of the nation. And these institutions, again, we have, as we set up the new, or I would say the data governance system for agricultural data, this is something that we have to consider again, because again, if they are perpetuating any form of exclusivity, this is a point where we have to correct and self-correct and create or develop or encourage the creation of institutions that are all inclusive. The question of agriculture, you know, it is the progression of the process of agriculture, the movement from production. I mean, as I said, it is a continuous process. And in that process, there's always a relationship with other components, for instance, environment, climate change, and all these, the several interactions that are existing, they create an opportunity for data to be created, and actually data is created. And again, so the question again is, how do we provide or generate or develop, set up a system that is responsive, that acknowledges that agriculture is interacting with other components and other structures and influencing the decisions on the other side. Now, the question then comes in, and I ask the question then, the question is, so what must we consider, like moving forward? What should we have all the time as we are having the question on...
Just to say that we have 1 minute left, otherwise we will not have time for all the presentations. Thanks.
All right, this is actually my last slide. And then, so the question is what to include. So contextualization of issues has to be there. We need to have gender responsive conversation, and gender responsive conversation, we actually mean that ensuring that we have the equal participation of both men and women, and the ability to influence the decision making in that process. And the several roles and independence of the roles that women play in the data creation processes, in agricultural processes, not only as data subjects, as creators, as controllers of the data in agricultural process, all these have to be considered. And then we can localize and contextualize the governance system to be reflective of the specific nations or countries that we are looking into, and the historical context that I mentioned. And then one last point would be probably on the future and the impact of adoption of technologies that we have as at today, because again, adoption has been at different levels and it has different impact in different countries. I will leave you with a comment by Kofi Annan, who says that, the deceased, may he rest, that without good data, we're actually flying blind. And if you can't see it, then you can't actually resolve it. And that would be it. My final submissions would be the picture of the nice smiling lady with a freshly plucked tea. She is a farmer, she's a processor, she's a controller, and she's a data subject. She's so many things combined in one. And with that, I will leave the conversation to proceed further from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much. Thank you also for giving the perspective of the Global South, because we are having different presentations today on similar topics, but from different perspectives. You will see now we have Liane from Australia, and then Ivo from, and Mark also from Europe. We have a couple of interesting questions. Actually, it's one question with a discussion in the chat, and I will, anyway, I will bring this question to the floor at the end of the presentations. Now, Liane, thank you. You can share your screen. We have Liane Weisman now, who's presenting on the merits of a mandatory data sharing scheme for agricultural machinery. Thank you, Liane.
Thank you very much. I hope that this will work. Oh, yes, great. I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you tonight on agricultural data. It's been some years. Valeria will know, and Emma will know that I've been speaking at RDA events, and I'm very passionate about the position of the farmer when it comes to agricultural data and the legal issues that we've heard about from Fontaine. And
sorry, Leanne, we see your presentation very small because we see the notes on the side. It's okay probably because your text is very big, so we can also follow like this, but be aware that they're quite small. I think we can follow.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Oh,
yes.
Apologies, sorry.
No problem.
So what I would like to talk to you about today is just what has been highlighted already is the fact that across the world, in Europe, America, Australia, and many of the nations, there are so many different legal regulatory approaches to agricultural data. There's not one way, there's not one law in any country that is dealing with this issue properly. We know that ag data is falling under intellectual property laws, copyright. There's issues around privacy law and personal data. In Europe, and America and Australia takes different approaches. We know that they're regulated by contracts with the licenses that machinery manufacturers often present to farmers, and that we know that there are significant competition issues. There are also, and I've spoken about this before, the very real legal tensions that we have around with philanthropic and open government principles around open data and the sharing of data. Most governments of the world have an open data policy that publicly funded data, including agricultural data, should be openly shared with farmers, shared with researchers, shared across stakeholder groups. So we've heard a lot about the agricultural data codes of practice. And these have sprung up in the absence of good legal regulation. So we know that it started in the United States. We've seen New Zealand, Australia. We are still working on our data code of practice, our farm data code of practice, because it's very controversial for a whole range of issues that we've heard about today. The power imbalance between farmers and machinery manufacturers. And what we have is actually done an investigation into the merits of each of those schemes. What is good about some of them, what is not so good. There is in Australia, as with the United States, there is a feeling that if you have a certification scheme that manufacturers, machinery manufacturers who rush to get certification are somehow up to be held up as global citizens because they've achieved certification under a data code of practice. But what we really need to do is look behind all of the good work that's been done on the codes, including the Golden Code and the toolkit. I mean, fabulous resources around how to implement these codes. But what's been highlighted is, are behaviours changing? Do we have farmers in a better position? Are they having access to their data? Are they able to share their data amongst their own farms, amongst their communities? Are they able to get their data back out of software systems, out of machinery that they're using, and use it in a way that they see fit? There were some broad principles and issues raised in the OECD paper around data governance and with respect to the digital transformation of agriculture. And it's really key that farmers want to have control over some of the data, not all of the data, but the data that is generated on their farm. So we know, and this is in the OECD report, is that there are clauses in some of the software technology contracts, and a lot of the work I've done is to read the John Deere licenses, to read these legal software licenses that come with the machinery that come with the sensors that are put in the ground, that come with the digital fencing or the collars that are put on sheep so that you don't need the fencing. There's so many bright, shiny things, basically, that are digitally enabled that are placed on farm. We know that those technology contracts are limiting farmers' rights in relation to the transfer of their data that's collected from their farm. So not only their agronomic data, but also their machinery data. So we know that these issues, as has been highlighted, the interoperability of data, the ability for a farmer to change from one product to another, from one machine to another, is really impacted by the terms of these software licenses. So we talk about good governance, we talk about the data codes of practice, but what difference is it really making in terms of the behaviour that we're seeing with the collection and aggregation across the world of agricultural data? There has been very little evidence that there has been a monumental shift in the software licenses that are accompanying the tractors, the harvesters, the machinery, the sensors, since these codes are in place. So what's really important is that I thought today that I'd just draw an analogy of what's been happening here in Australia, because we had this very same problem in our automotive aftermarket, which is the repair of our motor vehicles. So we had a voluntary code of conduct, very similar to the agricultural data codes of conduct. We had a voluntary code for many years that global car manufacturers would share the data that is needed for car owners to have their cars repaired, whether it's a BMW or Volkswagen, that an independent repairer would be able to access the information that they need about that particular vehicle, because otherwise it was locked to that manufacturer. For many years, we had voluntary codes, promises by global manufacturers that they would share this information to enable good competition in the market. And all of those voluntary agreements, although they were in place, failed to have any effect. So our competition authority highlighted this issue and said these voluntary data sharing agreements are failing. The independent repairers in the Australian market were not getting access to the data that was being promised to them. So at the heart of the competition issues, the competition authority said, our cars are like aeroplanes. They're so sophisticated, so technology driven, just as much as our digital agricultural machinery nowadays. They have dashboards. They look very much like a sophisticated aeroplane with thousands of codes in there. And this prohibits access to the data that machine collects. So our car industry, for competition issues, it was mandated that those global manufacturers would be required to share the data that was necessary to enable fairer access and fairer dealings between the independent repairers and the Australian car market. So the reason I talk about the car market here is just because we did have a voluntary data sharing code, and it didn't actually change the behaviour of the industry that we were dealing with. So we now have a mandatory law in Australia that forces global brands in the automotive market to mandatorily provide access to their diagnostic data to independent repairers for fair and reasonable cost. So this is a monumental shift, because this is a legal regulation that has stepped in because the voluntary codes have failed. What's interesting, at the same time, our Australian agricultural aftermarket has been the subject of competition inquiries as well. And it is because our farmers have the same issue, that they cannot access the necessary data that they need to repair their own tractors, to repair their own combine harvesters, or to repair any devices on farm. So the key issues is that they can't take their tractor down the road to an independent repairer. Australia is some of the most vast and regionally remote farming in the world, as with Canada and parts of Africa, where you will travel 4 or 5 days before you can find an independent repairer. So the Competition Authority recognised that there were not only issues about farmers getting access to the diagnostic code to fix their tractors, but hand in hand, they recognised that the farmers weren't even getting access to the data that they needed for their farms, which was the agronomic data that was collected by that machinery as well. So this particular issue has been followed up by our Competition Authority in a particular report known as the Agricultural Machinery After Sales Market. But if you notice on the slide there, the third bullet point is that the data ownership and management raises privacy and competition issues. And they're talking there about farm data. They're talking there about agronomic data that these machines are collecting. And this is at the heart of these issues around data governance. We can have all the codes that we like, but unless the licenses that the manufacturers are using allow farmers to withdraw their data, to have data portability, to revoke their consent, to be able to delete themselves from that system, then the code really sits alongside that and is not really empowering farmers in the way that they should. So this final report recommended that our Australian agricultural machinery should also be brought under a mandatory data sharing scheme in Australia, similar to the motor vehicle industry, where agricultural machinery manufacturers will be required to give access to farmers, if they seek it, to the diagnostic data that they need to repair their machines. This is particularly crucial when you're harvesting. There's a hailstorm coming, there's bad weather coming, you're harvesting and your tractor breaks down in the midst of a harvest and your only service provider is 3 or 4 days away. So what we're looking at in Australia in the next 12 months is a mandatory data sharing scheme for agricultural machinery. And that will be something that the ACCC, our Competition Authority, is working on to either bring it under the motor vehicle scheme, which is already in law and will come into operation on the 1st of July this year, or whether we need a unique standalone scheme for agricultural machinery and mandatory data sharing. This is part of a broader discussion in Australia around a broader right to repair, but these recommendations are very specific to agricultural machinery. So what I think really the question for us when we talk about data governance around agricultural data, and if we're looking at a farmer-centric approach, we really have to ask ourselves, and I'm really interested to hear from Ivo, who follows, about the position of these codes. It's fantastic to have them, they're wonderful, but where's the evidence it's actually changing behaviour? And that the collection and aggregation that's happening with agricultural data across the world is not still continuing in the same manner. So when I just draw a comparison between the voluntary codes that we've seen in Australia and that we've seen in agriculture, is we know they're self-regulated. It requires data aggregators to kind of measure themselves against a list of criteria about, do you have a clause? For example, the American Code Data Principle says, do you have a clause around data ownership? Not does data ownership sit or does the farmer have control of their own data, but it's, do you have a clause that addresses it? And everybody can get a tick on that. The question is, what does that clause say and what does it provide? So when you look at the features of voluntary codes, they're self-regulated. There's still an information asymmetry between global brands, global powers, and individual farmers, and even farmer associations. Whereas there isn't an independent umpire, there's no monitoring of what is happening in those industries. What happens if there is no compliance with the code? Is there enforcement? there's really no one who can enforce. There's no independent oversight of these codes. Is there any review of the codes? In Australia, we've built in a 6-month review, and then it will be a 12-month or a 3-yearly review based on what is happening in the industry. What we've seen with the mandatory scheme and what is coming into Australia is that there's an independent arbiter. There's a third party that will sit back and look at whether global brands are sharing their data with the independent repairers and what will happen if they don't. It's open and transparent. The pricing is open and transparent. And there's recourse to mediation and arbitration if one party refuses to participate in the scheme. There's also an inbuilt review after 3 years of operation of a mandatory scheme such as this that will be reviewed, and there'll be evidence provided of the change of practice in the industry. So I just thought it was useful to kind of just focus on what's changed in the last 5 years. Since we've seen the the US Farm Data Principles, we've seen the EU code, we've seen New Zealand, we've seen Australia, we're seeing codes developed all around the world. But have we got evidence that there's been a change in the industry about the collection and aggregation? And are farmers better empowered to use their data how they want to? Of course, they get value from the aggregation, but some farmers are in a position now, they're digitally literate, they're trying to do work on their farms. If they buy a couple of farms, shouldn't they be able to gather the data from those farms to collectively use it themselves, to change providers if they so choose? These are all the issues that we first talked about when we talked about farmers' rights and data. But we really need to ask ourselves, have we got the evidence that there has been that change? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you. Indeed, your presentation leads directly into Ivo's presentation. And Ivo, you can share your screen whenever you like. I enabled the transcripts because some participants asked for transcripts. If it's a problem for some participants, I can disable them. You will just have transcription on your screen now. Ivo, thank you. So Ivo is going to, the reason why I was saying that Leanne's presentation is leading directly into Ivo's presentation is because, as you see, the title is Beyond the Code of Conduct, a tale of open collaboration. And over to you, Ivo.
Thank you, Valeria. I hope you can see the full screen. You can, perfect. Okay. Yeah, Leanne touches a very political issue, specifically on repair and maintenance information, not particularly for whether or not it should be shared more. It's rather on the legislative requirements, and we have it already for tractors. And it means actually you have to develop websites where even individual pieces of information can be found, and you have to find a whole system around it in terms of asking for fees, etc., which should be non-discriminatory, etc. And you can ask yourself, certainly for a smaller sector, if this is really working. We are not like the automotive. There is not a big fight between the aftermarket distribution chain. It's rather about dealers that want to be more independent, but they still want to provide a full service. And I think the whole discussion, certainly in Europe, was done based on what's happening in the car industry, and that is, according to us, a bit the wrong approach. We are a much smaller sector. You have to be careful what it means, because it can be very expensive for everybody, inclusive for farmers. We have to always keep that in mind. We always want to go for deregulation and have regulation only where it's really necessary. Okay, beyond the code of conduct, tale of open collaboration. So if Leanne says, like, is something changed in agriculture machinery industry? Well, certainly there is a realization that as a manufacturer, you cannot deal with all that data and provide all the necessary services. So somehow for your customers, they will have to have the possibility to access a much broader set of applications and have further control of what happens to its data. So we fully look into that. But the problem is technology. But first of all, let me emphasize a bit, why do we want to go for a digitized agriculture? We know we came from the pure mechanization aspect. We added precision technology to be much more optimal in the use of our inputs. And by connecting vehicles, you can actually go all the way to plant optimized treatment, but also better management of your farming systems overall. Of course, you can have always traceability, for instance, all over the food chain, which ensures that you know what's happening with everything that you're doing along the chain. So it's about higher insight, deciding accordingly and acting appropriately. This connectivity, also machine to machine, for instance, is very important. But we're also talking about data sharing, business to business, business to governments, which will be an issue. So digital farming, what we need, this trust. That's why we developed this code of conduct on agriculture data sharing. It's a trust of farmers that they understand their rights and that there are some responsibilities. That's all what this code of conduct is for. Of course, we need the communication infrastructure and the technologies. And I would like to say one word, that's interoperability. So interoperable between ecosystems, you need somehow a way to let them talk with each other. And that's the main point. And of course, there is the aspect that we find very important, and that's also, for instance, related to any data related to repair and maintenance, is ensuring the machine safety and security. And the legislation that we have to fulfill is extremely hard to abet, and we have to make sure that also when you have connected vehicles, this safety and security remains. And of course, it will be important to prepare the future for new technologies and for autonomous and AI applications, etc. Now, what was this code of conduct? What it was all about, it was setting transparent principles, it was clarifying the rights and responsibilities, and this to create trust, not only for the farmers, but also among partners. So we kept it quite open, because as manufacturers, we also talk with suppliers, etc. We also need specific data, etc. There are also contracts there. It's non-binding, it's also not a legal text, although we refer, of course, also to, for instance, the GDPR. By the way, there was a question about what about data where you also have location actually. Well, if you have an indirect reference to a person, basically it's also subject to the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. So there is a lot of data therefore from fields that are actually subject to the GDPR. What are so these basic principles? There is the contract that was always been the basis, and we had in the past discussions about open data versus the contract law that we have now, and it was accepted that contract law actually works. It's just that the principles behind it, of course, need to be very, very specific. It talks about explicit, express, and informed permission. So we keep the farmer at the center of where the data is going. So he has the data control on who gets access, etc. So they have this leading role. We call them data originators, because they give the order for the data to come to origin, to come to being. Whether it's for machinery that are there to produce data, it's they that give the order to do it in their fields. And they also will decide to transmit or not data to another data user. So this portability of data is there. And they should also benefit from sharing data with any other partner they wish. And it's also about value sharing. So if you do anything that's not related to what you are normally supposed to do with your data, you have to inform them. And of course, that's also important. They understand that if there is sensitive information, like trade secrets, IPR, that can be shielded. Why? Because if we give access to them, we actually have to sue them immediately if they would provide it to the wrong hands. We cannot expect everybody to be a legal expert. This is an example of how, for instance, this sharing can be done. And this is just for a primary arable production of potato, where you talk about potato processor. The farmer itself, he works with contractors, for instance, who also works with equipment providers, who has his own suppliers, with an operator who also has his own right in terms of his personal data, etc. But the contractor has its right on particular ways that he does his work for a farmer, so that he needs to have in the contract how he can also shield that expertise that he has, but also that there is a way of data sharing, etc. So there are also here authorities, very important, that also will have somehow the link with the farmer and with the data. Now, this is the code of conduct. We have always said this is very nice as general principles. This is some trust by defining principles, but we think that if you really want to roll it out, this trust needs to be embedded in the proper design of technologies. So the infrastructure that you build and the use cases you build. And this needs to fit within this digital transformation. And that's why I want to mention here something that we are developing ourselves. It's called AgIn, it's Agricultural Interoperability Networks. It's not the only solution, but it's linked to machinery data and also to interactions with machinery directly. And that's important. And there, of course, we have to defend our legacy. We have developed Isobus, which is a brand independent way to machines to share information, whether it's for using the screen on a tractor, but also having task messages being sent from an implement to a tractor. So that the implement can actually say, tractor, I want you to drive, and that's this speed. And the tractor will respond, thank you very much for the task, and I will see how I can get there and if I can get there. This is also about extending knowledge and expertise from proven concepts. So we already have something in place to have trust between these independent brands on data sharing. And we want to leverage that to the level of digital platforms. By this, we also see that we can maintain legal compliance. And we can, of course, contribute to structuring what is happening. There are many initiatives. There are many solutions out there. Many claim that they have the one big solution. And actually, we are in a consortium together with many platforms in order to help structuring and finding a necessary setup and developing a common agricultural data space in Europe. And with this proposal that we have, and it's also in the consortium that we are in, we are quite loyal to the Code of Conduct on Data Sharing by Contractual Agreement. It is our basis. So basically, although there will also be legislation, and we have, for instance, the European Data Act, which is now there. And of course, we have to look to what extent it does follow the Code of Conduct. It mentioned it, but it's very horizontal. So it's sometimes very difficult to interpret. So we're doing that exercise as well. And we will certainly be also in contact with the Farmers Association to make sure that it's well taken note of, and that if something is wrong, that we can interfere in the legal process. So what is it about that we want to do? It's a non-discriminatory governed network. And of course, the farmer is at the center, but of course, it's about trust between the software providers that actually use or have control over the farmer data on his consent. So it's about reliability and trust between them so that they can enable peer-to-peer interfaces to other platforms, but they also can enable their customers to use their data in whatever agricultural platform they like. And don't forget, a lot of these platforms are kind of ecosystems. They also have their specific rules. You have somehow to see how these platforms, ecosystems can be connected to each other. Will there be only one system? Probably it will be a federated data space. And this is, for instance, one particular solution. We hope it can be embedded in what we want to develop within Europe. For an agricultural data space. I also want to mention that what we are developing here is together with the Agricultural and Electronics Industry Foundation. And this is a global organization. So what we develop here is actually for global rollout. It has three pillars. One is the network itself, which is based on AF security conformance measures. There's a use case solutions part where you look at a harmonized structure that you can use, which is the same for all, but the use case itself will allow to make specifications, including on rights on data. I give you the example, spraying a field. Looks like quite ordinary, but you have a label on the pesticide. You have the machine that has to act according to what pesticides will be used. And there is some data that will be resulting from the machine, which could be of interest to and the pesticide producer. Of course, there's some data for the manufacturers as well of the machine, but also for the authorities in order to prove compliance. This could be proved by data. So it could be a way for a farmer to prove his data. That's kind of use case. And you need to come up with the necessary specifications, which have to be put in standards. So the standard aspect was already mentioned before. And I really like that aspect because we live by standards. And on data sharing within agriculture, we will, I mean, as manufacturers, we can do our share, but we need much more help. So that's certainly an aspect to be looked at. And then there is contract. There will be so many more contracts. how to deal with that. So within this project, we're trying also to have a kind of contract framework where simplified contracts will be offered. Now, I want to talk a bit about how the structure is very quickly. The AEF has a kind of structure where you can simulate the interaction between the different platforms on data sharing, that it works actually. So you can simulate it, both whether it's for the trustworthy link for specific services. You get a certification based on that. That is done by a third party. And then based on that, you get your compliance and trust key. That's done by a public key infrastructure. It's something like you have on your phone when you want to log into your bank. It's extremely secure. And so it works with a key exchange. And based on that, you're fully covered and you get into the participant directory. And that means that the platforms that that are in this participant directory can actually find each other and exchange information. So that could be an OEM platform, like a machinery manufacturer, could be a farm management information system, but it could also be a simple provider of applications or from sensors who wants his sensor, for instance, also to be connected. Just to give you an idea, not going too much in detail, but it's about certification handling, it's about key exchanges. So the security and authorization is very important. And then you can actually do data exchange in a very secure, safe, automated way. And that's the whole principle. And of course, you can choose as a platform to which services you actually want to be compliant, depending on how your ecosystem works, what service you actually offer to your farmers or to your contractors or whatever. Now, so just a few remarks that are very important. Due to this key exchange can be done beforehand, you can actually have in-field data exchange to whatever tool. It can be to a sensor, it can be to an edge computer. Also with this system, innovative freedom remains, and the farmer's rights would be linked to data in particular use cases, because depending on the use case, there will be different ways of dealing with the data. You have to look at really within the use case, what data is really generated and who could have access to it. If that can be agreed upon with all these stakeholders and also maybe in link with certain legislation, we could have a much bigger progress on a number of basic operations in field, for instance. Governments could be linked directly or to other systems, to the network. So there can be an exchange of data to governments to prove compliance, but also for governments to monitor and evaluate their policies. A lot of the policies, people ask, why are they made like that? It's so much administration, etc. It's because they also lack trust and they lack data to monitor. So they will definitely underwrite the statement of Kofi Annan. We believe that this will definitely also facilitate compliance with other legislative developments that are now ongoing, like on AI, on security. We are working, by the way, as well, very heavily on a cybersecurity standard for our industry. On software updates, certainly an issue when you want to give more people the access to the possibility to do software updates, the security needs to be ensured. And that is one of the main issues why, for instance, we are very, very reluctant on repair and maintenance information sharing, just like that. And then, of course, yeah, that's what I said already. Policy monitoring evaluation is important. And this will certainly also be embedded in a partnership that Europe is doing on agriculture of data. So both data for the farmer to be used in order to make better decisions, but also for the lawman and, of course, to evaluate and monitor his data. We will not deal with all agricultural data in here. We focus to what is linked to the machine data. It is just one building block, just to remind you. It is also brand independent. Don't forget that there are many use cases out there with manufacturers and farmers, etc., that work together, but they know each other. So the trust is because of the face-to-face recognition of people. But here it's actually brand independent. So the world is open then, but you need to have very proper systems in place. And that is what we're trying to do also with this proposal. This is what we're trying to do in a consortium to develop this common agricultural data space in Europe. And hopefully this initiative can also be taken over, of course, globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivo. Thank you very much. We've gone into more technical stuff.
Yeah, sorry for that.
No, it's good. We're actually leading to an even more technical presentation now. We're actually going to deal now with the ethics of robotics with Mark Ryan. So thank you, Ivo. Mark, you can share your screen. And the title of Mark's presentation is Ethical and Social Considerations for the Development and Use of Agricultural Robotics. Thank you.
And yeah, just to clarify, it's definitely not a technical presentation. So it's focusing on ethics and social impacts. So I won't be delving too much into like the technicalities of AI and robotics. But certainly it's an area that's hugely relevant for data sharing, as the future of AI and robotics within the agricultural sector will require huge amounts of data in order for the technologies to fully function and work as promised. And today's presentation is based on research that I've conducted a few months ago, and it resulted in a publication in AI and Society in January. And my research involved conducting insights into 11 thematic ethical principles, which were outlined in the Jobin et al. Article. And these 11 principles emerged from the content of this analysis, and they analyzed 84 AI ethics guidelines that are used to frame AI ethics and the practice of AI ethics. And I used these AI ethics guidelines in order to compare and contrast with what has been said within the AI ethics literature in agriculture. Now, unfortunately, there's not very much that's been published in the area of AI ethics and social impacts of AI and robots within the agricultural sector. I could only find 21 relevant articles, and I used the Maxta 2020 data analytics software using lexical searches and contextual analysis of the 11 principles and synonyms within the 21 articles found. So just to contrast the two, so on the column on the left-hand side are how often the different ethical principles were mentioned within the 21 papers within the agricultural sector, and on the right-hand side is how often they are mentioned within the 84 AI ethics guidelines analyzed by Jobin et al. So as you can see, there's quite a striking difference between the two, with a much greater emphasis on issues of sustainability within the agricultural documents, and much less so on topics such as dignity and solidarity. But I'll come to that in a little while. So first of all, I'd like to go through each of the 11 principles and how they're discussed within the literature on agricultural AI and robots. So first of all, the most important one and most mentioned one was the topic of sustainability. So robots, sensors and drones, they hold the potential to leak fluid, toxic chemicals, emit fumes on the farm, as well as cause surface water runoff, encroachment on habitats, or general pollution to the surrounding area. There's also a concern in the literature that large and heavy robotic machines will lead to soil compaction. And also there was a topic that came up in the context of genetic modification to accommodate plants. So you have this issue within greenhouses and even on the farm itself, where agricultural robots, they're unable to pick certain fruits and certain vegetables because they damage and bruise the fruits, and they're unable to reach in to grab them. So there's been a lot of discussion within the literature, okay, maybe we don't need to redesign the robots, maybe we need to redesign the plants to become more sturdier and to allow the robots to accommodate them to pick and retrieve the fruits and vegetables. So yeah, it's quite a complex and strange solution to a technological problem. Secondly, in the context of non-maleficence, so for the audience, non-maleficence essentially means to do no harm. So AI robots may reduce toxic chemicals and pesticides, protecting the farmer from harmful health effects. AI may reduce accidents on the farm caused by human error. So similarly to self-driving vehicles, there's the hope and promise that agricultural AI will be able to drive and maneuver on the farm more effectively and more efficiently than human beings. So there's a possibility that it will reduce crashes and harms caused by human error. However, there's also a risk of how AI robots may distress or harm livestock on the farm. If you have autonomous robots that are maneuvering around the farm, will they cause undue stress or physical harm to livestock and wildlife surrounding the farm? There's also the concern that with greater digitalization on the farm, that it could lead to hacking, sabotage, and spying on the farm. So if you have this autonomous robot that's maneuvering around the farm, would it be possible to hack it? And if you can hack it, can you get it to maneuver and harm and sabotage the farm? Or could you just simply hack into it and use its visual capacities to spy on the farm and what the farmer is doing? Thirdly, in relation to trust, so AI may actually increase trust. So if you can identify and prove that AI technologies are able to retrieve, they're able to do things on the farm that are better and more efficient than the farmer can do, this may actually lead to a case of increased trust in the technology and an increased trust on the agribusinesses developing the technologies. But then also on the flip side of this, AI may actually increase distrust of agribusinesses. So sometimes farmers state that they're unsure about what types of data are going to be retrieved from the farm, what the agribusinesses are going to do with those forms of data, how they will benefit from them, and topics such as this. In relation to beneficence, so beneficence means to do good, so it's just in contradistinction to non-maleficence. So in terms of beneficence, it is important to identify the needs of the farmer before developing technologies that they will use. And also farmers felt that there is sometimes a pressure put upon them to adopt AI technologies for the common good or for the industry. So within the literature, a few times farmers mentioned that there's this sort of societal or external pressure, and if they didn't adopt the latest technologies, the latest gadgets on the farm, they were seen as backwards, they were seen as luggards, and that they will essentially be left behind. So farmers felt this burden that's placed upon them by society, but also by the industry. Fifthly, in relation to freedom and autonomy, so some companies prohibit farmers from repairing or tampering with AI hardware, and this impacts the freedom of the farmer and their ability to control and maneuver and repair their agricultural machinery on the farm. So there's been recent developments in the US in this context. There's been a right to repair bill. Some of you may be familiar with this. There was also the concern within the literature that farmers may have to give over control of their farm to AI decision-making because it is seen as more scientifically valid, more scientifically proven, and than the decision-making that they would have been making previously. There's also a pressure to accept the decisions from the AI company. So farmers may feel that they're pressured because of the high cost that they have invested in the technologies, that they're required and they're pressured into accepting the decisions from that the technologies would give. Sixthly, in relation to privacy, so there was a lot of concern around data sharing and that farmers must trade off some forms of privacy for the benefits and promises of AI on the farm. And one study demonstrated that 78% of farmers in that study were concerned about how their data would be shared and sold by corporations. Seventh, in relation to justice, so if AI is only deployed on rich, large monocultural farms, this may have a serious impact on the uptake of AI by smaller farms, poorer farms, and the global south. So there'd be an overall digital divide within countries, within regions, and within nations, and also within continents. And also in relation to justice, so farmers, there was a concern that they would not be the benefactors of AI. So the ones who would benefit would be from the agricultural businesses, those developing the AI technologies, but the actual benefits received from the farmers would actually be minimal. The 8th point was in relation to responsibility. So I think people mentioned this as well in relation to licensing agreements. The farmers, so John Deere have licensing agreements. The farmers will not sue the company if there is damage to the farmers' crops, land, profit, machines, businesses because of their AI. So there's a greater placement of responsibility and onus on the farmer. So they have to make sure that the machinery is well taken care of, but also that the machinery is able to navigate through the farms. And there's also a greater burden thus placed on the farmer as a result of this. In the context of transparency, so there was a concern about the interpretability and understandability of the data being retrieved from AI systems, and if these recommendations were accurate. There also needs to be a greater level of education, training, and understandability of AI within the agricultural sector to understand how the technologies work and also their limitations. So this came up in a few of the presentations today. There needs to be a greater level of understanding and education of how the data is being used, how it's been stored, how it's been retrieved, in order for farmers to make more accurate and more appropriate decisions with how the technologies are being used and deployed on the farm. In relation to solidarity and dignity, these two principles weren't really discussed within the agricultural documents. Solidarity was only mentioned twice and very in passing, and also dignity was not often widely discussed in AI ethics literature, but it is in certain other domains. So there's a huge emphasis on dignity within healthcare, ensuring the dignity of patients with terminal illnesses, dignity of patients being treated for very serious injuries and healthcare issues and so forth. How did the two compare? So how did the AI ethics guidelines, the 84 AI ethics guidelines, compare and contrast with the topics and principles that were discussed within the agricultural sector? So what arose in the AI ethics guidelines, but not so, or what arose in the agricultural sector, but not so much in the 84 AI ethics guidelines, was that there was a much larger emphasis being placed on species, on the environment, and on sustainability within the agricultural texts, but much less so within the AI ethics guidelines. There was also little reference to employment within the AI ethics guidelines, despite its very high level of importance within the agricultural sector. And conversely, what arose in the AI ethics guidelines, but did not appear in the agricultural literature. So the two topics of transparency and dignity and solidarity were not mentioned a great deal within the agricultural literature. So transparency was rarely discussed, despite it being a very important topic. Transparency in the context of data sharing, it has been mentioned a few times today, and it's also a very important topic within data sharing and also within the overall literature on digitalization within the agricultural sector, but specifically within AI ethics literature on in agriculture, it wasn't mentioned within the 21 documents. Also, dignity and solidarity did not arise much, although there could be clear areas where these could be important for the development of AI agriculture. So that's everything I had today. I just sped through it a little quicker than I would normally. And yeah, just to leave a few minutes for questions and conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks a lot. Yeah, indeed, we have a few questions in the chat. I was wondering if I will ask all the speakers if they are happy to stay another 10 minutes to answer a few questions. Thank you. Those who have to go can go, of course. And we have some questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask the people who asked the questions in the chat, if one of your questions was particularly burning and you want to ask it, you want to raise your hand and ask it. Yes, we have a person with the hand. Claudia, you want to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is a very wonderful and exciting session. And it occurred to me that lots of the topics you've been discussing they are very relevant to other domains because agriculture deals with people. So all of what you have been discussing has to do with ethics and social sciences. Agriculture deals with machinery. So again, raises issues in ethics and engineering and health and ethics in health. Okay, so it could be the basis, what you are discussing, of a global ethical data conduct, because it deals with all fields, so except for the arts. Okay, so what would you say is very special about agricultural data that has nothing in common? It's unique with other fields that are dealing with ethical data in health and social sciences and engineering, whatever. Thank you, thank you. This is to all speakers, okay?
Thank you, Claudia. Who wants to pick up on this question?
I might just quickly say one thing, is that question's often asked, what is special around agricultural data? I think if you can use an equivalent of, with personal data, we're looking at our, obviously individual, very personal information, but when you're looking at agricultural data, if you're taking a satellite image of a farm, as we know happens, and aggregate that with soil, moisture, all of the other information, you're basically getting an individual's taxable income from that data. It's GPS kind of located to an individual, it becomes personal information. And when you're looking across other sectors, people who run businesses, you can do a Google Earth search across that business. You won't find their financial information, but with farming you can. And I think that's a really big distinction.
Yeah, I agree. Someone else who wants to answer? Ivo.
Yeah, thank you. What is different with other sectors is that at the end, we're talking a lot about business to business. Farmer is a business, but often it's an individual or a family, and therefore we put much more emphasis on keeping the farmer in the center. And that's different from many other sectors. From what I understood from discussions I had with Directorate General Agriculture at the European Commission, we were one of the only sectors that go that far, which is unique. And of course, it has its reasons, both economic, political, that farmers are upstream, but not so much upstream when it comes to the value of their production. And that is why indeed a lot of the information that is gathered from data should go back to the farmers. And the reason, for instance, that we have very good relationship with farmers on these aspects is that we are delivering machinery for farmers. That's our primary goal. And the better they are doing, the more we are doing as a business as well. So for us, there is absolutely no reason to not want to have strongly involved and knowledgeable farmers, because it will increase their business overall. And of course, there is this huge drive for sustainability, etc. And so doing optimized farming, and that's why this control of the data is actually crucial. And that's also a fight, by the way, you see sometimes in the Commission as well, between DG Connect, the people in charge of, for instance, the Data Act, so how the data is shared, and DG Agri. So just as a comment on that.
Thank you. If someone else wants to answer this, otherwise we have another couple of questions in the chat. Thank you, Claudia. So there was another question from Elizabeth, but Elizabeth in the chat said that her questions had been answered in the chat. It was actually an interesting discussion, first on codes of conduct and how to choose if there is a way of, a place where you can go and find all the codes of conduct. There were several answers to that, but then there was a question from Simon Imoro. I don't know if you want to ask it live or I can ask it for you, Simon, if you're still there. The question from Simon is, how do we manage and balance mandatory open access to agricultural data, data ownership, and rights to privacy? So these three things. To what extent can data may be open and accessed? Of course, respecting privacy and data rights. Someone wants to take this one? Ivo?
Yeah, I think so. We have three things. Data. Yeah. If you talk about rights to privacy, I think the GDPR is active. It was, by the way, it was a big cost also for our industry to make the necessary separate databases, protected database, in terms of protecting the privacy. Because whenever you want to share data internally in your company, you have to have there is a link, but you have to make it anonymous. So you know that it's like a number, but you don't know the name, so that not everybody in the company knows. So it's actually covered. When it comes to data ownership, I think that's technology, yeah. And of course there need to be some legal guidance on that. We have, for instance, this Data Act that we have. It's really related to contracts. It's business to business, business to government contracts, and the rules by which you have to agree. So that's really written in stone. And when you talk about balanced mandatory open access, when you really talk about open access, it means everybody gets access to it. And I can tell you straight away, the farmers would be the first to be against it. I mean, it's one of the reasons we started this code of conduct. People are saying, hey, all this data should flow freely, so it's for researchers and the whole world will benefit. A lot of farmers are very afraid that it's used against them. Mm-hmm. So we have to be very careful when you talk about mandatory open access to data. For instance, we work on solutions so that data that farmers can voluntarily, if they want to, prove compliance to legislation with data. But it's voluntary. Make it mandatory, and I don't think we can even start working on it. We have to be very careful on that subject. So not for us as manufacturers. If it's mandatory, we have to share it. At the end, it's not our data. It's theirs. We fully understand that as manufacturers, and the reason that some of the data is not shared and people think that we keep sitting on that data is just because legally there's not much we can do with it. We understand it's from the farmers. We also have always said that. But just as some remarks on that.
Thank you, Ivo. Does anybody, I don't know if Caroline and Foteini, you haven't spoken in this last part of the meeting. Do you want to say something about this?
Well, definitely there should be a balance between the interests of, let's say, agribusinesses and farmers, which is the most difficult part, if you ask me. What I would respond somehow to Lian's basically question with the codes of conduct and the mandatory data sharing agreements. Following that question, what is the difference? How, if there is any difference, how I perceive it is that exactly up until a couple of years ago, there was no legal framework around agricultural data. Still, there is no clear one. Hence the need for the codes of conduct. They are voluntarily, they are not legally binding, that's true, but it is a good first starting point to engage the stakeholders in the agricultural sector, to balance the interests, to balance the concerns around privacy. So it was and still is a good starting point. And as I've seen, for example, Australia was, and we all know they were one of the first that developed the codes of practice, and following it was noticed that at some points it doesn't really work. So we do need some legislation. So I agree with the concept of having some mandatory schemes. But on the other hand, I do understand the reluctance from the agribusiness perspective, like if I perceived it well, Ivo mentioned. So there is, we need to have a cultural shift. Already we've noticed that things have been done with the codes of conduct. A lot of things need to be done. For me, certification schemes are important to have an independent authority. With the mandatory sharing agreements, yes, I think it's a very good a very good approach. Of course, taking into account privacy issues with farmers' personal data. Only that. Other than that, I found it a very good idea for having legislation. But as you know, legislation always is the last tier and always the most difficult to implement. Hence, the first need of having codes of conduct. And via that road of codes of conduct, we come to legislation. This is how I perceive it.
Thank you, Fateni. I have another question now. Gideon raised his hand. Gideon, the floor is yours.
Hi. Yeah, very, very interesting presentations and discussions. I just adding on to what was just said in the previous things on this open data. It's really a key question is open data for what? So in some cases, having data in open access, there are very good reasons for doing that, because there is benefits for all. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to go into open data. Very often, data can be made available without any information in there that would link it to individual farms. Even in the case of geospatial granular geospatial information, which is in there, if you blur the data enough that it points at a general direction and not at an individual farm, that is very often for a lot of purposes more than enough. And you're not sacrificing people's privacy, their information that pertains to them that could potentially cause harm, even if it doesn't cause harm in 99% of the cases. It really matters if it is that 1% where it causes harm. And this is where this making things in putting data in open access in a way that that it is sufficiently anonymized and blurred that it doesn't that it no longer points at individuals is crucial. Now, for a lot of other data where you say, okay, we do want to share things very specifically because it needs to be connected with other sources of data, that is where there are technological solutions that could come into play, which gives the data provider, the farmer, control over where that data is going, who is using it, and why. Some of these technologies are based on blockchain. Some are using other approaches, but there are ways of doing that, and recognizing that, especially because you are already talking about data that is being generated through in systems of where there is a lot of technology embedded already, makes the use of those kind of technologies much more feasible. It's a different story when you're talking about smallholders in low and lower middle income.
Yeah,
there the issues are different. But then the first point that I made of sufficiently anonymizing and blurring the data definitely still holds there.
Thank you, Gideon. I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on this, because I would like then also to ask something to Caroline, since what Gideon was mentioning now was the difference for smallholder farmers and perhaps also in the Global South. If anybody wants to directly answer what Gideon said, they can raise their hand, or I can maybe leave. Ivo, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, just quick. I fully agree with Gideon. I mean, there are different use cases that can be dealt with when it comes to sharing of data. For instance, you could leave farmers the choice, and if the technology is available, for instance, to provide information to researchers, even personalized information. Why not? I mean, sometimes it can be of information as well. There could be that authorities for the general benefit will be asking farmers to join or to team up in terms of data, so that it can be, for instance, a better monitoring of outbreak of diseases. This is also certainly also very valuable for countries in the south, so that that information can be very fast spread and can be used to restrict and prevent the outbreak. So things like that could certainly can be arranged and can be technologically developed, so that it's clear under which conditions as a research, for instance, you can have information. Also in terms of how to protect the personal data from the farmer.
Thank you. Indeed, each of these topics would actually deserve sort of a session on its own. But I wanted to conclude with Caroline, because she was actually in her presentation mentioning that the issues particularly related to smallholder farmers in the Global South. And I think she can give us a different perspective also. And I wanted you to just tell us what you feel is the main difference in dealing with these issues with big farmers in developed countries and maybe smallholder farmers in the Global South. Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the big problem is actually, again, about access, as mentioned, and the challenge of achieving a sustainable and a fair balance between the small-scale farmers and the large-scale farmers. The challenge, again, is mostly on how that data is created, because in most cases, what we have seen is that the large-scale farmers actually also rely and collect the data from small-scale farmers, and then they are able to store it and they are able to manage it and control access to that data to an extent that even the state or the government is actually unable to access that data. So again, it's a question of balancing commercial interest really with public interests at the same time, and also making sure that the system does not invest or vest so much rights as opposed to so much rights in the commercial interest really, as opposed to also balancing them up with the small scale farmers. And it's the same. Again, it's a question of balance, because either way, even when you talk about other IPs, intellectual property patents, etc., again, it's about setting the exemptions within the law to allow access of the innovations that have been developed, even for commercial purposes. So again, how that can look like as at now, probably is another conversation altogether. But again, at least having those exemptions, not only for research, but also for making sure that there is equitable access across the board, so that everyone is able to access the data, not for any other reason, but at least for decision-making within the agricultural process, production process, yeah.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you. Indeed, all of these things would deserve a separate conversation, and I would be happy if this conversation actually continued with other sessions in the future, webinars, and also in this collective action that we are conducting. We are going to invite you, if you're available, for other webinars and papers. Thank you very much to all the speakers, really, for very interesting presentations. The participants, we are thanking you in the chat. And with this, I think we can close the webinar, we can close the recording, and we will send you a link, of course, to the recording. Thank you.